In a world dominated by social media and internet memes, as well as one in which the Holocaust is being appropriated by anti-Semites to use as a weapon against Jews defending themselves against genocidal terrorists, does the legacy of Elie Wiesel still resonate for a new generation? Wiesel's writing taught the world about the Holocaust, but as anti-Semitism comes back into fashion among elites, intellectuals, and the arts, how can remembering and rediscovering his legacy help us find our way back to a saner world? Today, on Think Twice, we talk with Elisha Wiesel about the new documentary film about his father and why he is still so important in understanding the world we live in. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important pre-Rosh Hashanah conversation for you about the legacy of Elie Wiesel with his son Elisha. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily, on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. And now, to today's program. There was a time when Elie Wiesel's impact on not just the world's understanding of the Holocaust, but also on our culture, was obvious. But nearly 70 years after his Night was published, 39 years after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and more than 30 years after Oprah Winfrey introduced him to an even wider audience on her TV show, are he and his work being forgotten? In a world in which the Holocaust has become just a metaphor for something bad, or anything someone doesn't like or agree with, or anyone be characterized as another Hitler, is there a place not just for Wiesel's thoughtful prose and storytelling, but the insights about the tragedy of the Holocaust that he taught us in an environment dominated by TikTok? And how should we view his work from the perspective of living through a revival of anti-Semitism in our own time as Jews and Israel are demonized, sometimes by people who claim to care about the lessons of the Holocaust? A new documentary film about Elie Wiesel, Soul on Fire, has just been released that should both reintroduce his legacy to a new generation and also hopefully ignite a discussion about how we should think about the way the Holocaust is being understood in a world in which, once again, Jews are being targeted. To discuss it, we're honored to have back with us the ideal person to discuss the subject. Elisha Wiesel is the son of Holocaust survivor, author, and Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel. After a 25-year career on Wall Street with the Goldman Sachs firm, where he eventually became its chief information officer, he retired from the firm in 2019, and since then he has worked on hedge funds, Israeli startups, as well as on philanthropy, social justice, and political activism. In particular, he has taken up the effort to carry on his father's legacy as an advocate for human rights and bearing witness against anti-Semitism. Elisha Wiesel, welcome back to Think Twice.
Jonathan, thank you very much.
Well, Elisha, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about your role in the making of the new documentary about your father, Soul on Fire, and why you think a reintroduction to him and his work is important at this particular moment.
Great. The thing is, I had been badgered ever since my father died by filmmakers who wanted to do a reproduction of Night. They all wanted to put their own creative energy into telling Night in their way. And the good news was this was one of the few things I had very explicit instructions from my father from. He never wanted any creative to get between him and his reader of Night. So that was very easy. There was never going to be Night the movie. On the other hand, we did feel that my father had had such a remarkable life with such an incredible message to tell. And my mother and I were both concerned that with the passing of time, perhaps his recognition might fade in the same way that so many people here in America no longer know what Auschwitz was. Maybe they would forget that my father existed and what he stood for. So we went in search of a filmmaker. We enlisted our dear friend Annette Insdorf, who teaches film at Columbia University, And we basically did a search. We watched a lot of movies, and we encountered a film called Hiding and Seeking. And then I said, this one's it. Mom, you got to see this. This is the film. These are the filmmakers. And it was actually Oren Rudavsky and his partner, Menachem Daum. Menachem sadly passed from illness last year or 2 years ago, so was unable to be part of the film. But that's how we came to Oren Rudavsky to make this film.
That's very interesting. You speak in the film, and have done so before, about the difficulty of growing up as the son of this iconic figure. But now in Soul on Fire, we see your children being asked to discuss their grandfather and to be part of this journey in which his life and the Holocaust is again being examined. What was the process of being part of the making of this film like for your family?
We really opened up our doors to Oren and his film crew to come in, and I learned things because of it. You mentioned the pressure that I had felt, how it felt to grow up as the son of an iconic man like my father. There's a moment in the film where both of my kids expressed that they feel pressure, whether from me as a parent or my father as a grandparent. But I actually learned a few things in the making of the film about how my own family was engaging with the legacy that I had not necessarily thought I might learn.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And that's just not even taking the fact that they do come into your home. They do follow you. They follow your son back to Seagat, where your father was born, the lost Jewish community there. That's quite a process of discovery, I guess, for him and I guess for you as well.
Yeah, and there's so much that didn't make it into the film, not just with my immediate family here in the States, but Oren ended up spending quite a lot of time in Israel with my cousins. So my father's sister's children all live in Israel, and they have incredible stories to tell. A lot of the photos that we found from my father in the post-war early years came from Sidney, who is the son of Hilda, the eldest of the family. A tremendous amount of the stories, I think were came from discussions with Steve. So there's a lot that didn't make it in, which is why I'm pushing Oren that hopefully one day we'll do another one of these.
Yeah, and I think for anyone who is familiar with Elie Wiesel, who's read the books and who thinks they know the story, there's a lot in this that even, I'm speaking, I'm of the generation who was profoundly influenced by your father's writing, gobbled it up. It really helped, sort of form, the way I looked at the world. There's stuff in this film that I certainly didn't know, and I thought I'd read all the books.
I had a moment, even recently, a friend pointed it out. A friend was really observing something as I was watching the film for the fourth or fifth time. You look at that Bitburg scene, and first of all, there was so much new footage, which Oren had uncovered, which was tremendous. That scene in the Oval Office proper, when they're still trying to head off that impasse.
With Malcolm Homeline there sitting beside him.
Yes, exactly.
Young Malcolm Homeline. Boy, I haven't seen you in a while.
There's some great characters in the mix. And
when you were there, you get a little cameo in there too. You were there.
I was a little pisher, but I'm there, and but I'm learning something new. Like I'm watching it, and you see how much my father was sweating. My father was not I don't think of my father as like a very physical man expressing physical attributes. Usually I think of him as he's calm, he's measured, he does what he has to do. He was always giving lectures. He was very used to being under a spotlight. And you see just how hard that moment was for him, how hard it was to challenge a president, how hard it was to find the right words and hope that they were the right words.
Right, and being asked about it afterwards by Sam Donaldson.
Yeah, but you see how... But I was learning new things, seeing just how hard my father was working. And, it's not easy to stand up and do what my father did. And I think that was a recalibration for me as well. He made it look easy, but it wasn't easy. And in that moment, when you really on the big, big screen get to zoom in and you relive it and you see those beads of sweat, just really going down my father's sweat, not easy work.
No, not at all. The film discusses not just the narrative of his life, though that is certainly there, and how he came to writing, but also the way the passage of time after the Holocaust enabled not just survivors to begin talking about their experiences, but perhaps also the world to begin to listen to them in a way that it wasn't in 1945. But just as the Six-Day War and the Soviet Jewry movement made the writing of Elie Wiesel resonate for the generation of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and now all these decades later, we're in a very different moment of history. How do you think your father's work resonates for people today living through what, we have to admit is a revival of anti-Semitism and demonization of Jews and Israel after October 7th?
First of all, one of the major pieces of evidence that this is an incomplete film, because how can you capture a whole life in 90 minutes? Soviet Jewry doesn't even come up once.
Right.
Wow.
And he was so important.
Wow.
The Jews of Silence was so important
that book
to a whole generation of people.
That book in 1965 is what put my father on the map as a political activist, way before Bitburg. That's when he started actually saying, boy, I can use my words to not just tell the story of the Holocaust,
I
but
should
more
add,
importantly.
I read that book before I ever encountered Night.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Yeah. It's one of my favorite books. When my father passed, I spent that week during Shiva. We scheduled a few hours each day when the crowds would subside and I could just get a few minutes to breathe. And I redevoured Jews of Silence, I think, in those first few days. That was the book that I wanted to turn to capture him at that moment when he became an actor in the world, as opposed to just a victim telling his story, if you will.
Yeah, yeah.
You asked about the relevance to today, which is what I was going to touch on now. What a world we're living in where, once again, the Jews are blamed for things that we shouldn't be blamed for. For what? For defending our country against the violent attacks by Hamas, for Israel stepping up to retrieve the hostages, to make sure that Hamas never again has the teeth to do what it did on October 7th. So it's so tragic to see what we're happening. And I think that it's good for people to remember my father right now, because my father was a beloved universal human rights figure who never compromised on how important his Jewish identity was to him, and never compromised on how deep of a Zionist he was, just how much he appreciated the existence of Israel, how he refused to criticize it because he knew that everybody else in the world would criticize it. He didn't need to jump on that. He felt the need to defend it because there were so few defenders of Israel. And my father also, if you look at this context, I want to go bigger for a moment than just October 7th, though that's so hard for so many of us. My father was also a patriotic American who was no less patriotic for having stood up to Reagan on Bitburg or for having stood up to Obama on the Iran deal. Mm-hmm. My father was he loved this country. He had a vision for it. He felt that this country was capable of more good than any nation state had been in the history of the world. So for all of that, to remind people right now at this time when it's in fashion again to beat up on Israel and the Jews, when it's actually in fashion to beat up on America, and actually, go to people who are patriots and make them feel less so, like you must be ignorant to be a patriot. There are a lot of people right now, it's very popular in intellectual circles to bash on America and the dream in which we stand for. And for all of these reasons, I think it's very important to remember my father right now.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And that is an ideological trend that we're dealing with. I think one of the most discouraging things for those of us who care not only about the legacy of Elie Wiesel, and for whom his work meant so much to the formation of our own understanding of the world and our Jewish identity. And I speak, as I said, of myself, and I'm sure many others, when I say that the thing that discourages us most is the way the Holocaust has become something of an all-purpose metaphor for anything that people think is bad, just as we know the common practice of defining anyone we don't like as another Hitler is now so prevalent. Is this, do you think, a failure of memory, which was, your father's cause among the causes and the point of so much of his writing? Or is it because of a failure of the kind of Holocaust education that people are being given?
I think that when Holocaust education is given, it does make people more empathetic. But I am an avid reader and fan of Dara Horn, whose work I'm sure you're familiar with. And of course, her central thesis is that the Jewish community sort of went all in at the poker table and said, Holocaust education is going to fix our problems. If only more people are literate about the Holocaust, they won't hate Jews. And of course, that doesn't work. Maybe it builds empathy for, as she says, the dead Jews. But that's a big stretch to thinking about the fact that 50% of the Jewish population lives in Israel, is confronted with terrible decisions on how to maintain security at their borders. So I don't know. Did we go too deeply on just that one strategy to fight anti-Semitism? Probably. To the extent that people are trivializing the Holocaust, is it a disappointment? Yes. Is it a big surprise? Probably not.
Yeah. Well, anything that people gets out there, and I think part of that problem is how they're being taught to think about it. If it's just another bad thing, if it's just the same thing as any ordinary unkindness, if it gets sort of dumbed down to that, I don't think people are going to learn much from it. It just, as I said, becomes an all-purpose metaphor.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, your father, as did his best to stay out of politics. He was always very, very vocal about that. But as we've already touched on, he was drawn into at least one famous controversy, President Reagan's visit to the graves of SS soldiers at Bitburg, Germany. I think almost against his will, which is seen very clearly in the film. And as you say, when you spoke of him, really being under the spotlight. When he lectured the president live on TV, yet failed to dissuade him from going. This incident is, I think, a central part of the film, but how did he view it in the years that followed? And what do you think it teaches us about how we should think of the principle of speaking truth to power?
First of all, you should know he had a fondness for Reagan. He didn't see Reagan as an enemy. He saw him as a man who was being badly coached by his advisors.
Can we mention Pat Buchanan and his role in that?
I think my father felt in later years, as more was uncovered, and of course we can't help but think about the more recent book about the Biden administration by Jake Tapper, but he felt that perhaps the President Reagan was not 100% there already in the sequence that was unfolding around Bitburg. So my father, I think, tried to be more generous in his interpretations around Reagan in particular.
Yeah, that's interesting that he would put it in that context. But Reagan was still pretty articulate at that time. He just was, in fact, he got into trouble by some of the things that he did say, which appeared, and he had to walk back, which he was almost claiming that everybody was a victim, including the SS soldiers, which was,
you saw that on camera. It's just you can hear a pin drop when I see that in the theaters.
Yeah, well, I mean, and even for those of us who did love President Reagan, who was a great friend of the state of Israel, that was really a terrible, terrible moment. Yet your father was equal to it. I think a lot of, had he not been such a singular figure, had a ordinary Jewish leader would never have, had the chutzpah or the standing to say what he said. And it would have resonated far less if anybody else had been put in that position.
Just remember, the Jewish leaders didn't want my father to make the speech.
That's right. And that is mentioned in the film. And that is so typical of Jewish leadership in this country. We could do a podcast episode just on that. And I think actually we have.
My father, when I was in college, I remember, there weren't a lot of things he asked of me. This was more in the flavor of guidance. It was not a commandment, but he pulled me aside. I think it must have been 18 or 19. And he said, Elisha, you can do whatever you want to do in life. You like computers, that's great. Whatever it is you want to do. He's like, there's just two things I really recommend you not do. A, don't become a rabbi. And please don't get involved in any kind of communal Jewish leadership.
Yeah.
He suggested that this was, there was only misery in that direction.
That's true. Well, we need rabbis, and we need good rabbis more than ever. But that was pretty good advice. Your father never, as a rule, criticized Israel. You already mentioned that. Even if he didn't necessarily agree with what a particular government of the day was doing. But now, as so many Jews have their as a Jew moment in which they bash Israel, and we're taping this the day after the Emmy Awards, where we had some as a Jew moments, people bashing Israel and going talking about free Palestine.
Hannah Einbinder, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And really lend support to its enemies, and it's so ubiquitous. But that's really the opposite of what he was doing with respect to Bitburg, wasn't it?
Well, the worst is that so many of these people think that they're acting in keeping with my father's values. I've seen signs at Israel-hating rallies that actually say, Elie Wiesel said, the enemy, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. So a lot of people go around and they think, I'm being Wieselian. I'm not indifferent. Look at me. But of course, I think my father hadn't properly envisioned at the time that he made that statement how we've gone beyond indifference. We've gone straight to what I like to think of as indignant ignorance. People are indignant. They're definitely like they care about their issues. Whether or not they're informed, not so particularly relevant, but they're really, really indignant and not so listening.
Yeah, that is part of what we're dealing with now. Now, anti-Semitism may still have been alive, but in what perhaps we could call a period of decline in the first decades after the Holocaust. But it's certainly back with a vengeance today. As someone yourself who has been vocal about advocating for human rights issues, on issues that have nothing to do with the Jews, such as human rights in China, which was actually the topic when you were last on this show a few years ago, where do you see your duty today as someone who is well known for his advocacy to speak up about the demonization of Israel after October 7th?
Yeah, my father didn't believe in these, false choices. So I certainly don't believe it's an or choice. And by the way, kudos to you that you haven't framed it that way. Others have. Some people like to say, are you going to stand up for, everybody else's human rights? Or are you going to stand up for our own in the Jewish community? Why does that have to be a choice? Why can't we do both? My father certainly did both. That's why I think he's such a compelling figure for us to remember in this day. But I feel a strong responsibility. I think that, believe it or not, the group that I actually think has a large part of the answer in fighting anti-Semitism really is Chabad. I think that the idea of reminding people that we're not just going to fight anti-Semitism, and because we fight anti-Semitism, that makes us more Jewish. We should be more Jewish because we believe that there's value in Judaism, whether it's the traditions, the faith, the values, the stories, the music, whatever it is, the things that bind us together. I think we have to double down on that. And when I think about how, I've channeled my own energy, I feel like I've channeled more energy into the education of my children, that they should know what a joyful Shabbat dinner table looks like, with the benching of the grace after meals, with the candles being lit, with the proper kiddush done. One day they may choose to give that all up. I hope they don't, but let them do that from a position of knowledge, and not just intellectual knowledge, but truly emotional knowledge of what it was that our ancestors had created around that dinner table for so many centuries. And I think that that's a major part of what this fight is really about, is to not let it just become a political slugfest, but to really return a little bit to the value that we have and that we want to perpetuate.
Yeah, I think that was part, it was an element of the power of your father's writing, is that he was so firmly rooted in Jewish tradition, in the Hasidic tales, which played such a role in much of his work. It wasn't purely analytical. It wasn't purely memoir, and that is something that is that was part of the power of his work, and it's also, I think, why it needs to be reintroduced to a new generation. I mean, he was a very ubiquitous, for a few moments in our modern Jewish history, Elie Wiesel was a very ubiquitous figure. Obviously, as the years go by, it's been almost a decade since his passing. As a natural factor, I mean, he's not there anymore. And yet, we need to reconnect with that same sort of vision of what Jewish life is, and yet that there's so much pushback against that.
It's like we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back. How can we expect the next generation to be invested in this fight if they don't know what they're fighting for, if they only know what they're fighting against? Oh yeah, anti-Semitism is bad because it's like racism, and racism's bad, therefore I should fight it, is very different than feeling under personal attack. This generation, I think, to a certain extent, they don't feel what I feel in my heart. When Israel is attacked, it's visceral, it's gut level, it's emotional. This is 50% of my brothers and sisters in the Jewish people, so many of whom came, whether fleeing the Farhud in Muslim lands or whether fleeing the Holocaust, to get to Israel. These are people, my brothers and sisters, have gotten to a place where they can finally defend themselves and create the state that is transforming the world with its inventions and its ideas. And I feel that viscerally. And if you don't know what you're fighting for, I think it's very hard to fight. And I think that's also true for the thread we were discussing earlier about what it means to be American. If people don't appreciate the incredible privilege it is to be a citizen of the United States of America, what the United States of America has represented on the world stage for centuries, as a superpower, as one that seeks an order based of democracy and liberty. If you don't feel that, then why are you going to bother teaching your kids that that's valuable? Why are you going to invest in civics? Why are you going to invest in things that build as opposed to destroy? I think it's very important on both those issues.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. As someone who grew up in New York, and if you've lived your life in and around the city, I'm going to ask you a political question that maybe, I don't know whether your father would have dodged if he was still with us, but I'm going to ask you, how do you view the rise of Zohran Mamdani, who is an open foe of Zionism and arguably the defender, at least of anti-Semitic positions, as the probable next mayor of the city? And what should we be thinking about this as Jews, not merely as political actors and people who have opinions, but how do we process this change where this is now acceptable?
Well, I guess there's a few questions here. The first is, how does this happen? And I think the how does this happen comes when you have a generation, as I said, that hasn't grown up with a real deep appreciation for how fortunate we are to live in a capitalist society. The word capitalism has become, it's a negative thing now in the same way that Zionist is negative. So much of the evil empire that we defeated in the Soviet Union, its ghost kind of escaped and made it into the modern American university. So that's a real problem that we have. But if you look at how he portrays and presents himself, I actually think Zohran Mamdani might be an idealist. I don't know him. He has ideals. They're ideals that are deeply opposed to the things that I believe in many cases. But he comes across as idealistic at a time when I think so many citizens feel that politicians are by definition cynical. And, does Cuomo, do Adams, have they captured the imaginations of voters in the same way where they see them as, devoted public servants who are doing it for idealistic reasons? I think Mamdani comes off as an idealist in a citizenry that is trained to fight back and push against cynicism. So I think that some of it has to do with a lack of emerging candidates who can have that youthful idealism but channeled in a way that we would feel is more constructive. You talked a little bit at the beginning of the episode about how, I was once upon a time struggling under the load of my father's iconic nature. And when I was a kid, I remember by the way, I still love punk rock music. 16, 17 years old, all my favorite bands were punk rock. It's actually touched on in the film. I love the aggressive music, the idea that you can scrap the order out of chaos, you get a certain resonance. But that's music, to so much of the Free Palestine movement to me, and so much of the tear it down, anarchy, let's end capitalism, has all of the violence of punk rock without the good music. It's just people, looking for change without thinking too hard about what they're going to build or what should be built. So that's, I think, how you get there. That's the cultural phenomenon. What are we going to do about it? Look, unfortunately, one of these candidates, Cuomo or Adams, is going to have to drop out, and they better do it really, really fast. I'm not going to, in this podcast, opine on which one it should be. I think,
and I guess we should give equal time to Curtis Sliwa.
And of course, equal time to Curtis Sliwa. But he's also taking up some vote share. Some combination of these challengers are going to have to drop for there to be a chance. And look, if God forbid Mamdani wins, this will not be the first time that the Jews have anti-Semitic leadership, or that it's been a while that we've had to actually deal with it as direct as this. But, we have a 2,000-year history of having survived a lot. I don't think that all Jews should flee New York. I think we should double down, rebuild our institutions. I'm a big fan of what Maury Litwack is doing with the Jewish Voter Action Network, where he's trying to mobilize the Jewish community to punch at the weight we should be punching on. So I think there are certain initiatives that over time will enable us to not end up in situations where we have anti-Semites or those who have flirted or condoned anti-Semitism in high office in the city. And we'll fight, if we have to play black and go second in the chess game, if we have to fight with a weaker hand for a little while, we'll do it. We're going to be a loyal opposition that's determined to come out the other side stronger.
Yeah, well, that's quite true. It does, what you said just also make me think that perhaps sincerity is a very overrated virtue in some instances. But you're right.
Expand on that.
No, I think because lots of bad people are very sincere. I mean, that's the point. I mean, obviously, people respond to authenticity. As we've seen, in politics as it plays out in, American life, Donald Trump is seen as very authentic. And whether you agree with him or disagree with him, and that makes people crazy to have this discussion, people know where he stands. And there's a certain sincerity to that. And, I think much of the stuff that he's doing is good. I'm not here to endorse or, make political endorsements. But I think we also know that throughout history, some of the worst people in history have also been very sincere. The Nazis, many of them were very sincere. They thought they were the good guys. Some of the worst people think that they're the good guys. And that is part of the snare that I think people get drawn into, in this particular situation. There's a whole there's multi-causation, as you've touched on. I think some of the toxic ideas that have driven so much of the sort of negative discussions about Israel and the sort of the destruction, and you rightly tie it to, sort of a war on American values and a war on Western civilization that's going on campuses. That's enabled this too. And, sort of all that can be very sincere. The people chanting globalize the Intifada and from the river to the seas can bespeak sincerity, but it's also ignorant. It's also, quite frankly, speaking up on behalf of what I think is a very evil cause. So, yeah, I think sincerity can be very overrated. So there, I said it.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah. So I'm always, it's my podcast. I ask the questions, but I'm always willing to answer some too. So thanks for that. I want to switch back to discussion about your father's legacy. I know you've been involved in the creation of a space at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg for your father's papers. Can you tell us more about that project and what you envision that to do?
Sure. It's actually, there's a few things that are going on. It's the Florida Holocaust Museum, which is in the St. Petersburg area. And the Florida Holocaust Museum is the recipient on a very long-term loan of many papers and documents and manuscripts and photographs that accumulated that we're in the process of, basically settling as part of my parents' estate as we go through this incredible mass of materials. Gratz College in Pennsylvania is really our primary digitization hub. They are digitizing everything from my parents' library and making it available ultimately online to researchers. And then there's an existing archive as well at Boston University that had been negotiated by my parents during their lifetime. So there's three separate archives.
Yeah.
Where he used to teach, that's correct. So there's three archives. We're looking to unify them. And we actually think it's going to be great because the Florida Holocaust Museum is devoting a lot of time and energy and money to properly creating a space where we may even get to recreate what my father's office looked like. So hopefully it will become a destination for those who want to know my father more deeply.
That's great. Now, your parents also created a foundation for humanity. And I might add, your mother, I think, plays a very prominent and very deserved role in this film because she was not just pivotal personally, but pivotal in terms of his work. Tell us about that foundation and where it stands today.
Sure. So the Elie Wiesel Foundation was created shortly after my father won the prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. It was created with those funds as seed money into the foundation. And throughout its lifetime, it really had two purposes. The first was to sponsor human rights conversations in places and on topics that needed it. So the foundation convened conferences in Belgrade. It convened conferences in Ireland where we brought Protestants and Catholics and even Bono to the scene. It convened a conference in 2005 or 6, I think 2006, with Olmert and Abbas to try to restart the peace process when the Israeli government had indicated that they would welcome my father's help in doing that. My father would never have gone to try to create one without the government, but when they were ready, he's like, okay, let me be helpful. Let me see what we can do. So that was one set, international conferences, particularly using the convening power of the Nobel name to try to activate other Nobel laureates. My mother was particularly interested in the Ethiopian Jews. And a lot of that was driven by her having come to this country in the 50s, being an initial NAACP member after she saw Black people mistreated in the South. And she spent quite a lot of time doing work for the NAACP. So when she heard that there was, this influx in process of Ethiopian Jews being airlifted into Israel, her immediate fear was, God forbid, there should be the sort of racism in Israel against people with dark skin that we've had for so long in America. Let's see what we can do to cut that off at the roots as early as possible by creating family and youth education centers in the cities where these children are going to be going. So that's the Beit Zipporah project, named after my father's little sister who died in Auschwitz. And those have been two major arms for us. Now, I took over the foundation about 2-3 years ago as chairman. We decided to reactivate the human rights space by engaging on the Uyghur issue, as we discussed last time. And we also are continuing the work we've done on Beit Zipporah, but we're starting to think more broadly. We're thinking of all the different hats that my father wore. My father was a human rights activist, thus the human rights work. He was an educator, so we've launched educational work with one of my father's original TAs from Boston University to teach the next generation of moral leaders. My father was a journalist, so we ultimately envisioned doing something in the journalism space as well. We want to align it against these hats that he wore, and we finally succeeded in hiring an executive director. We began a search about 3 to 4 months ago, and I'm thrilled to announce that Liz Ann Eisen, formerly of Cravath and the Fresh Air Fund, and a number of different financial ventures, has joined us to be our full-time executive director, and now I think we're really going to start seeing things moving in the coming year.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. Elisha, thanks so much for joining us today. I do recommend that our viewers and listeners see Soul on Fire. It's an important documentary about a very important subject and more timely than ever. And also pick up, go back and start rereading if you've already read them, or reading them if you haven't. Elie Wiesel's corpus of work. They're very important. It helped frame a generation and needs to inspire more generations. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to read JNS at jns.org, subscribe to our newsletters, and also tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the audio podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us on any one of those platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org, and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. Last, I want to wish everyone a happy, healthy, peaceful, and sweet new year of 5786, Shana Tova U'Tuka, from all of us at JNS. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.